Okay, so this is a brief audio review of Invention of Heterosexuality and Darker Shades of Queer. Okay, so when it comes to this invention of heterosexuality, right? Before we had heterosexuality, because again, we assume that heterosexuality has existed for as long as our species has existed, in a kind of practical way because we physically exist. So obviously people procreated, right? That it's unchanging, that it's universal, that it's ahistorical. But in reality, the idea of heterosexuality is a very modern invention, and it dates to the late 19th century. So when we notice how recent that notion is, then, that's how social scientists that look at sexuality have, been able to look at how heterosexuality, when it was constructed as a category, was then privileged as normal and natural. So when we look at this over history, we can see the definitions change, and that challenges the power of heteronormativity. So anywho, back to before heterosexuality. So during the time period of early Victorian true love from 1820 to 1860, the reading talks about how this is the time period with the ideal of true womanhood and true manhood that revolved around purity or the freedom from sexual desires. Right, this is when we get the graham cracker and things like that. Fun fact. Graham crackers, except for obviously in the context of s'mores when you put it with a marshmallow and chocolate, but graham crackers themselves, as well as I believe it was cornflakes, things like that, were supposed to actually curb sexual appetites. So anywho, basically during this time period, it was considered really gross, basically, the human body, right? So the human body was thought of as a means of, procreation and production, but it was considered really distasteful for someone to have sexual pleasure. So even though they knew that, they needed sexual procreation, true love was really only for marriage, right? So this idea of sexuality is only for marriage, only for the purposes of procreation, to create appropriately gendered children. We get to the late Victorian sex love era, 1860 to 1892, and this is where the kind of heterosexual lust became a bit more widely documented and named. So during this time period, several factors caused this eroticizing of consciousness. So, obviously the way that people think is going to affect their behavior. And so also, as well as emotions and identities. And so the larger economic and structural changes that were moving families from producers to consumers also changed people's relationship with their own bodies. So the growth of the consumer economy promoted a new pleasure ethic. Before this time period, people were supposed to refrain from things instead of indulging in them, right? Haste makes waste kind of thing. So, but at this time period, the economy was changing, right? We're getting into this kind of industrial revolution time period. And as a result, people are then, charged as consumers. People that are there to consume things, or things are supposed to be easier and more pleasurable when you just buy them or use them, right? Instead of saving and not wasting and making them yourself. So it's interesting how the consumer ethos of the time affected the actual body politic of the time. So during the same time period, there was a rise in prestige and influence of the medical discipline. This really fostered a need to define what is normal sexuality. So this is where we started getting these terminology of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and this is where that term homosexuality came from, out of medical discourse. So when it comes to heterosexuality, those first years, right, the time period where it was actually known and noted as a concept. So the original definition of heterosexuality was constructed as deviant, meaning a person who wants to have sex for non-procreative purposes. So the earliest use of the term homosexual happened in 1892, as people whose general mental state is that of the opposite sex, or at least that's how they were understood. Later research typified it as an attraction to the same sex, and the theory argued that the natural inborn sexual drive is what motivates us to produce offspring. So this new category that was called heterosexual created a new norm that came to dominate our idea of the sexual universe, changing it from a mode of reproduction to sexual pleasure. Then we get into this time period in the early 1900s, right? What they call the distribution of the heterosexual mystique. So during this time, the opposite construction of the sexes were presented as the basis for normal, meaning, this erotic attraction between males and females. So again, normalizing heterosexuality as dominant. So the stress on the duality came from the earlier Victorian era and its ideals of true womanhood and true manhood. And those ideals reflected the changing nature of society and the deep anxieties that came from shifting work and social roles of men and women that were happening as a result of the changes in the larger economy. So part of this norm related to sexuality, as well as starting to see women as also having sexual drives, which of course undermined the Victorian idea of the true woman. So we get to this time period from the 1930s to 1945, and during this time, the word heterosexuality is much more used in wider society, right? They note that it was used in the New York Times, in just larger cultural media. So it starts to become more of a known term, not just in medical literature. Once we hit 1945 to 65, this is kind of this hegemony takes hold, that heterosexuality is normal and natural. So the cult of domesticity that followed World War II reassociated women with the home, motherhood, and childcare. So this is the period where heterosexuality became hegemonic, or the dominant system. And Kinsey's research came out at this time, which questioned what is considered normal by presenting sexuality as something on a continuum. And if you're not familiar with his research, it was very interesting. It was kind of the most comprehensive sex education research at the time, and really just trying to look at, how do people understand their own sexuality, their own desires, what do they experience, etc. And he, instead of saying sexuality was either heterosexual or homosexual, he actually placed it on a continuum and found that a lot of people, actually a large proportion of people in America in the 1950s, found themselves somewhere in the middle and not at the extreme ends of the continuum. So this caused quite a shakeup because his research became widely known and distributed. So once we hit 65 to 82, this is a time of social change where a lot of norms were being challenged. So you have, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, anti-war movement, environmental movement, gay liberation. All of this kind of stuff is going on at that time period, which was all about challenging norms and extended to sexuality. So during this time, there was movements formed and struggles were made for inclusion and rights of dominant into the dominant heterosexual society. So basically saying that, maybe our understandings from the past were too narrow, defined, and don't actually encapsulate people's real experiences. All right, moving on to darker shades of queer, race and sexuality at the margins. So, in general, some people assume that being a marginalized person means that you're going to be more sensitive to issues of social justice, meaning if you're a sexual minority, you're somehow going to understand the experiences of racism or be sensitive to the issues of racism. But it's too simplistic. Some people can be empathetic or experience some sort of shared sense of marginality, but again, it's an oversimplification. In fact, some people do not experience this empathy. Some even lean in to defend hegemonies instead of the marginalized, or compare their oppression as if it can be a thing you can win at, right? Like, oh, what's worse? Homophobia or racism. You're like, well, they're both bad. There's no winning there, right? So some theorize that people do this because, they want to have some sort of power or power over others in the culture. In this case, white sexual minorities may be wanting to buy into the dominant culture. Who knows? The issue is that the author is saying that it's a pervasive issue, that there's homophobia in communities of color and that there's racism in queer communities. So with that aside, moving on to race and sexuality. So whiteness in the gay community is considered the norm and is inescapable in media representations of homosexuality. And so of course this affects understandings of the reality of the diversity of the queer community. So when it comes to homophobia in communities of color, this has long been an issue as there's always been a conflict between religion and acceptance of homosexuality. And religion has also been used to justify racism and misogyny, and has promoted patriarchy as the ideal family unit, but for minorities. This means that you could be facing issues of reluctance in coming out to your family, in fear that you're not going to be accepted, which can cause conflicts for some in how they fear that they're going to be perceived, right? So again, if you're already in a marginalized community and that's what gives you support and identity, you don't want to risk losing that support and identity by coming out. So some issues of racism in queer communities are also, again, rampant. So gay men and women of color have trouble becoming leaders in the queer community, according to the reading, because they're being pushed to the margins. So when, they're trying to determine the agenda of what should be struggled for, what are the issues that should be in the forefront, minorities are often, their issues, their concerns are not the ones being brought to the forefront and being tackled by the larger movement. Also, when it comes to dating, many in the queer community internalize racism that they experience in the culture, which can also affect who they, assume they are allowed to date, who they, seek to date. And this has a racial preference towards whiteness that really affects all sorts of people within this kind of understanding of the community, right? That there's a preference for even what we call colorism, that it's not just, between racial groups, but also within racial groups. So the author argues that the solution lies in abolishing the masculinity that's seen in larger society, meaning if the problems of white supremacy and patriarchy are manifesting in the culture, then they're also going to be mirrored in marginalized groups in often subconscious ways that can affect how people interact within the community.